All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to be with everyone and to see you all here. Today we're really excited to talk about options for exploring outdoor education for a safe, joyful, and equitable return to learning in DC. We know this is a really stressful time for everyone, and we want to make sure that we're doing our best to address all the inequities that are coming out of the COVID crisis, to think about everyone's health, everyone's mental health, and ways that we can address so many of the concerns of both students, teachers, and parents during this time. So we're excited to have a great list of panelists today to kind of talk us through both the health aspects of this, the engagement, and what outdoor learning will look like itself. And we're really excited, particular, to hear from all of you out there in the community about what questions you have, what concerns you have, what hopes you have for this kind of a program and for solving the problems that we're really setting out to address with this. And so feel free to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat as people join. We're just going to start with just a little bit of an introduction to what we've been doing on advocacy for outdoor learning and a little bit of background of what's happening on this kind of throughout the country. So we want to start with just the vast inequities that we're seeing across the country in learning experiences during COVID, and how much stress so many families are feeling with the inequities of homeschooling, of pods, of the difficulties of remote learning, of getting students motivated to participate in this way, and what everyone is personally experiencing in so many different ways. And this really struck me about the inequities in learning that we're seeing. So, you know, we have so many people who, with the means, you know, this story was just in the New York Times just a few days ago showing $25,000 pod schools, people spending so much money who have the resources to access continuing education and to try to make the year as normal as possible for their children, for those who have the means to do so. At the same time, as soon as I saw that headline, what struck me was the memory of how many times I've seen how few Americans have under $400 in the bank, right, for emergencies and for savings. So there's just huge inequity in what people are going to be able to do, what people are going to be able to access in this year. And it's really important, as you see that third headline there about working parents trying to find childcare, that we have some solutions, right? That we come to the table with some solutions to address the difficulties that everyone is coming to the table with, to make sure that we do our best that this COVID crisis not exacerbate the inequities we already know exist in our education system. And we know these inequities are going to exist. And we also know that outdoor learning is something that's happening and will continue to happen in certain places, right? So you can, everywhere from the San Francisco Bay to right here in Washington, D.C., you can see the headlines about these outdoor learning opportunities. This is a Jewish day school in the middle, featured here in Washington, D.C., where students will be returning for small group outdoor instruction. It's happening throughout the national capital area in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, up and down the East Coast, the West Coast, and throughout the country. But really the question is, who is going to have access to these kinds of learning opportunities? There's been a real growing movement for this throughout the country. A lot of stories, both in the national media, but also locally about, you can see in that story about New York City teachers pushing for an option for outdoor learning. And there are places actually where outdoor learning has been happening nearly since the start of the pandemic, particularly in California, where there's been some schools who shifted almost immediately to outdoor learning and have been in that mode for several months now, seeing remarkable success with very few, if any, reported cases of COVID through this structure. So we'll talk a little bit about the science in just a minute, but we really want to start with, what does this look like? Let's give you a sense of what these options can really look like in practice. So we have several pictures here. Some of them are from DC, some of them from some surrounding areas and places that are doing outdoor education throughout the country. And you can see at the bottom there is Dr. Blackburn as a teacher. This was actually when she was teaching at Excel, and we'll have teachers talk about their experience doing outdoor learning, particularly with younger children. I was actually out in Rock Creek Park this morning. It's a 90-degree day, but it felt beautiful. It felt like maybe it was a 70-degree day under that deep shade. And so there's so many opportunities, despite the weather, to get students outside, to get our young people outside in particular, to give them a safe environment during this crisis where they can where they can interact with each other. They can have limited social interaction in a way that's still safe and healthy. Everything involves risk, and we want to make sure health and safety is always the first priority before we consider any return to learning. But we also want to make sure that we don't have those most affluent and those with the most resources have these opportunities and others left behind. So what does this actually look like in practice? Every kind of setup. There's people who literally just move their classrooms outdoors. You can see on the right what a typical kind of yurt tent, this is a larger one, looks like, where you just set up tables and chairs, to the very full classrooms. This is a company that actually sells this kind of pop-up classroom that's weatherproof. It has Wi-Fi. You have year-round kind of temperature control in it, but the sides are still open for ventilation. They set up smart boards, electricity, bathrooms. So we know there's a lot of concerns about how you can do outdoor learning in different environments. But it really is possible in so many different kind of ways, using our natural resources as a city and reclaiming those spaces, especially for those who haven't had so much access to them. And this is something we can do in DC. You see some of the remodeled schools at the top with great outdoor space, but even for those who don't, looking at the bottom at that picture in the middle, in the bottom there is Anacostia Park, where actually I was out there yesterday, and it's just looking out at the vast expanse, right, of open space, where our pre-K students could be out learning in very safe, socially distanced environments and interacting in small groups. And then you have Oxen Run, the bottom left, also in Ward 8. And so there's so much beautiful outdoor space for us to use equitably across the city if we can get access to that. So the final question here is really what we want for our kids. Do we want them to have these joyful learning experiences, right? Or only virtual as an option? We know virtual is going to work for a lot of people. We know it's important to have because it's not safe where we are COVID-wise to go back to our classrooms. But when we talk about joy, when we talk about mental health, when we talk about socialization for our children, looking at this difference is really important. And this really kind of was a dagger for so many people who saw this online recently. A picture on the left of what the lunchroom looks like right now for students who have returned to school in other parts of the city, and seeing these children have to be spaced that far apart outside, inside the building in order to have lunch. Meanwhile, on the right, you have Dr. Blackburn's classroom there where the children are eating their lunch outside. And I think just comparing the joy, right, in those two situations is really important. That's a word I'm using a lot because I think especially for our youngest kids, this is a time of a lot of anxiety and stress. And so every opportunity we can to give them a joyful experience, I think is really, really important. So we're gonna now talk about the science of this, and I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Abdul Rahman of Children's National Hospital.
Thanks, Scott. My name is Iman Abdurrahman. I'm one of the emergency medicine physicians at Children's National, and I'm very happy to be part of this. I have been thinking a lot about the impact in children. I have a first grader where, virtual learning hasn't worked, so I'm glad you guys are thinking about it and doing this. I'm just gonna go very quickly to talk a little bit about the virus and how it's transmitted. I think really understanding how it's spread will really help us what the risks are in different environments. The virus is spread from person to person through large droplets. As you can see, the red dots coming out of a person on the left. The droplets can land within 2 feet. And that's the majority of infection we think are through these large droplets. There's also a concern that particles could be suspended in the air and somebody can inhale it. And this is primarily the reason why indoors is fraught upon, or we're concerned about indoor environments where the air doesn't circulate as much. Next slide. Another way that it's spread is when people are not washing their hands and they're coughing or sneezing to their hand and shaking somebody else, or they're touching high contact areas like doorknobs and then touching their face, nose, and eyes. Understanding how it's spread will also make sense when the public health messages of wearing a mask, washing your hands, and being 6 feet apart when you're told to do that. In terms of COVID-19 in children, there's a lot we don't know. From what we know so far, children are getting COVID-19 less often, and we don't think that they're a major source of transmission. But there is a study that's, that started on May 1st. It's an NIH-funded study. They have 6,000 kids and about 2,000 families. And they're going to be looking at these two questions that we're still kind of wanting to learn about. Next. Again, I'm not going to go in detail about how to stop the virus. We all know that we have the power by following the public health messages. And I recommend that people go to the CDC website, since we learn new things every day about this virus. We're 6 months in, and there's a lot we know and there's a lot we don't know. So I want to make sure that people are going to the CDC website. Next. And then here, I just want to talk about risk benefit. And I think Scott talked about, you know, anytime we step outside of our house, we will increase our risk a little bit of getting the virus. But we also have to kind of figure out, you know, what are the risks of staying out indoors and doing virtual education, where we, you know, minimize our risk versus the loss of learning when we stay inside. So understanding our individual risk is going to be very important, and each person has to think about that, because each individual family has different circumstances. And the next slide is an amazing slide. On the left, it talks about the public health recommendations of, you know, the physical distancing, the masking, and all the things that I just mentioned about. And then the slides that just talks about the different activities and the risks. Again, outdoor classes have lower risk than indoor seatings. Outdoor playgrounds, again, lower risk than being indoors. And so when we kind of weigh the risk of not learning and virtual education versus, you know, being outdoors, the social emotional aspect of it, and then especially with young kids, in-person education is just much more effective. And so just, you know, again, I think it's just lower risk and probably more important to have that in-person education. And I think that's it for me, unless anybody has questions.
And could you just mention briefly just kind of what we know at this point about being outdoors versus indoors in terms of spread, and how the virus actually, you know, leaves and might be transmitted to someone else in those two settings?
Yeah, as far as I understand, I don't think we know a lot about, you know, a lot of situations where, you know, outdoor settings have led to outbreaks. Again, I just don't know enough. I just don't think I have the information in terms of like how much of the infections so far are spread from outdoor setting. I think there have been some outdoor settings when people are in close contacts, not wearing masks. But when people are following all the public health requirements outdoors, I'm not sure of any outbreaks. But again, I just don't know, you know, a lot of the information is kind of not available, but it's definitely lower risk.
Appreciate that. Yeah, and you know, there's been several studies on this, and we're still kind of getting all the information, particularly about children, right, as the doctor noted. And I think, you know, one thing that one case study, right, that we did have was kind of with the mass protests that happened over the past several months, where there were a number of reviews, right, and reports on that showed that it seemed like those mass protests even were not responsible, right, for an increase in spreading COVID. And that's obviously, we're not going to have mass gatherings, right, even when we're talking about outdoor education. And so doing well, everything has a risk. You know, this is one of the, this information here on the slide comes from NIH and other sources, that one of the top risk reducing actions we can take is to have our class outdoors. And Dr. Abdul Rahman will be here, and if you have questions as you go, feel free to submit questions, both and then Q&A, and we will come back to questions in a little bit. But really quickly, Brenda, a quick question for the doctor. Brenda, did you want to ask?
Scott, there are two Brendas on here. That wasn't me.
Got it. Brenda, so the other Brenda, if you want to submit a question, go ahead and just submit it through the Q&A, and then we will we'll do a larger question and answers at the end here. I wanted to turn it over now for a parent perspective to Offset Pons.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm still at work. I'm trying to get things together. I so apologize.
No worries.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here as well. My perspective on the outdoor learning, I really think is awesome. Mainly because this has really been like a serious process with my daughter, with Haley, over the summer and at the end of the school year. It started off pretty okay at first because she was excited, I guess, to do things online and with her iPad. But after a while, it was not a good fit at all. And I really feel like that for a school year it would set her behind in a way. She's so used to being in a classroom with her friends, and she keeps saying how much she misses her teachers, her peers, and being able to play with everyone. And realistically, to be able to come from that and then have to go online, it's just not good at all. And then to be able to have to go to school and possibly wear a mask is going to be even worse, because I've been trying to work with her as well as some of her cousins. I've been doing like practicing like with school and stuff over the summer. And it's been really hard trying to get them to practice social distancing with the mask inside so they can get used to that, because realistically, if they do go back to school, this is what they're going to have to deal with. And they're young. They're not going to be able to keep that on all day long, try to not touch one another and play with one another and still keep their distance. And that's been like a serious problem for us. Even when we tend to go out to places, trying to get her to not touch things. And you know, kids, especially young kids, that's the first thing they're going to do. They're going to just straight try to touch a toy if we go to a mall and touch a toy. Or they're going to instantly want to take their mask off because they feel like they can't breathe. I know even for me as an adult, it's kind of hard. Keeping this mask on all day long and still have to go to work or go to the store anywhere. And I really feel like it's sad for kids. They're just missing out on a big experience by having to go through this right now. Even if they I feel like also with the virtual learning, I feel like she really started to depend on electronics a lot. And I had to take away her iPad. For the last month, I've been just strictly doing activities. Especially her teacher, Miss Erica, had gave us a binder over the summer that different activities that the kids can do, which has been really helpful because she's really become dependent on that iPad. Now she feels like that's the best thing ever because everything's on there. Her learning activities are on there. She can watch her movies. She just feels like school and everything, since everything's on there, I should be on there all day long. Yeah. But I really feel like it sucks because you're missing out on so many great things as a child. It's with child activities. So that's how I feel on that. I really am excited about you guys bringing this to us about outdoor learning. I think it's really awesome, and I really hope we can do it.
Thanks, Ms. Pons. I really appreciate hearing that perspective and struggling with a lot of the same things you talked about as a parent myself. And it's really hard and trying to find ways to bring joy to our kids and especially for kids who are so young that they don't really understand fully what's happening right now and why they can't see their friends or why they can't go on the playground, why they can't be in school. So that's really important to share. There are a couple questions and we will address, we're going to do a larger Q&A at the end, but I just want to address a couple of things. In terms of how can we effectively implement outdoor learning when the school platform is virtual, we're going to talk about exactly what we're proposing in a little bit, but it's really as a complement to the virtual learning and not to replace it. So there would be outdoor kind of learning hubs throughout the city, and we'll get into that in a little while, where parents and others could voluntarily register when the time fits their schedule. And then in terms of the science behind outdoors, certainly something that needs further study. And like we've said, in terms of all options to return, we've been saying all along, we need to reduce community spread before anything is safe to do. And so that is the first priority, to get our health and safety metrics where they need to be to make anything safe, right? But this is a safer option, right, than being indoors. And especially when you look at how the extreme cost of the HVAC repairs compared to the reduced risk of being outdoors. And what we do know from studies so far is, I think the one that was most extensive said there was about 19% lower transmission outdoors than indoors. And so definitely, like the doctor said, something that needs more study, but there's been pretty conclusive evidence about the relative safety of indoors versus outdoors. And we'll definitely get to the logistics a lot more in just a moment. But I want to turn it over now for an educator perspective to Colin Radics Carter, who's a DCPS teacher, and who will talk through the work that both he and his colleague, Dr. Blackburn, have been doing.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colin. I am a pre-K 4 teacher at Mann Elementary, and I'm also going to speak on behalf of Dr. Erica Blackburn, who will be teaching at Stevens Early Childhood Center in DC as well. So both of us as being early childhood educators, we value the idea of our young students being outside. I mean, just for the health reasons they need it. But I think especially more so for me as a Reggio-based teacher, and then Erica using creative curriculum, there are opportunities within those curriculums where we're able to utilize being outside as a way to help our children learn given the materials. So if you're going to be learning about trees, it makes sense for you to be outside to learn about trees, for example. Scott will probably follow through with just some aspects of what Erica did last year, what she did with her students as far as being outside and just being able to connect with her students last year, not just as far as curriculum, but also just being able to eat outside, being able to play as normal. But I think taking advantage of the environment to be able to paint, being able to sing, being able to do read alouds. So all the things that we kind of value as early childhood teachers as far as our children's learning, you can easily make the shift from doing that into the outside environment. One thing that I think, especially with outdoor learning, can be an interesting take, especially as far as an investment, is thinking about how children, especially young children, can be advocates for areas within the city. One thing I think, especially as far as young children, we tend to think, oh, because they're young, they do not know a lot and we have to provide that information for them. But most early childhood educators will tell you that if you give children the opportunities and if you immerse them in certain opportunities where they feel empowered to be agents of change, they can be the ones who can kind of advocate on their own behalf of the need of their own needs as far as their learning. So I hope that, you know, especially with as far as outdoor learning, is the idea of, you know, we're very fortunate that we're in DC. We're very fortunate that we do have a lot of outdoor spaces, you know, like Rock Creek Park. There are places along Oxen Run that our children may utilize as far as social events, but we don't often think of them as places where learning can be extended. And an interesting possibility it can be is, what if children are given the opportunities where they can be able to be advocates for these spaces, not just for the social and the health benefits, but also as far as their learning benefits as well. So I think in giving this opportunity, it might be a way to expand upon the learning, as well as having children feel really connected to the cities that they live in. And I think especially given the spaces that we have in the city, I think it might be a great way for us to utilize a lot of these areas where people may not necessarily make this quick connection of, oh, children can learn in these spaces, but how can we make that a long-term investment as far as making sure that all students have access to these spaces, so that it's not just a place to play, it's not just a place to exercise, but it also can be places of learning as well.
Thanks, Colin. Really appreciate that. And it's a really important perspective about reclaiming the spaces, right, for themselves and equitable access to those spaces. And I just love seeing these pictures, right, of this Dr. Blackburn doing this with her students at Excel Academy in Word 8 last year. And obviously it looks a little different, right? When you're wearing masks, you have to keep the groups a little smaller, but, you know, really important to just kind of see this visual and want to talk about the social emotional benefits of this. So Dr. Byron McClure, who's a school psychologist and on the redesign team at Anacostia High School, wanted to be with us today, but unfortunately he had a last second emergency. So he recorded a video so we can give a little perspective on what is social emotional learning and how does it work outdoors. There's been a growing movement for outdoor social emotional learning, which he's part of, and as especially important to our students who need it most. So I'm going to let him share a little bit about that. See if we can start this here.
Hey everyone, I'm Byron, And we're going to spend some time quickly talking about SEL and the benefits of outdoor learning. First, let's begin by looking at what is SEL? Well, SEL is a process of acquiring skills such as self-awareness, social awareness, empathy, relationship building, and even making good decisions. Now that we have somewhat of an understanding of social emotional learning, let's look at outdoor SEL. Outdoor SEL is the focused use of the outdoors to help heal and nurture our capacity to manage thoughts, feelings, and emotions in order to foster positive relationships and engaging learning activities. Learning outdoors can be an immersive and exciting activity. It can help activate all of the senses. Students who use the outdoors as a context for learning receive a host of academic and social emotional benefits. Some benefits of outdoor SEL include about 75% of students who spend regular time outdoors tend to be more creative and better able to problem solve in the classroom. You might also see a decrease in absenteeism, increased ability to concentrate, to cooperate, and even increases in leadership. You also see students improve relationships with their peers. They have higher motivation to learn, and you see increases in confidence. Perhaps one of the best benefits of outdoor learning is that young people develop a sense of connection to their neighborhood and community.
All right. Thank you very much to Dr. McClure for sharing that. Wish we had him here for Q&A, but certainly he's willing to share, and there's a new outdoor social emotional learning movement that we'd love to share more with all of you, but you can follow them at Outdoor Cell. And I think they're also on Twitter at Outdoor Cell. It's a movement throughout the country, but Dr. McClure here at Anacostia High School is one of the leaders on that. And I want to move now just to talk about how we make this an equitable approach. I've seen that there are a lot of questions, and I promise we will get to an extensive discussion of all of the logistics in just a minute, how this complements virtual learning, how we make it safe for every community. But I want to turn it over to how we kind of make sure there's equitable access for this. And one of our partners in this movement has been Friends of Oxen Run, a great outdoor space in Ward 8. And so I'm going to turn it over to Brenda Richardson to talk a little bit about what this equitable access can look like.
Thank you, Scott. And Ab is also on as me down at the bottom without the picture. Can you connect him as well? Hi, everybody. My name is Brenda Richardson. I'm with the Friends of Oxen Run, and I'm also an eco-feminist. I think that outdoor learning will create a sense of wonder for our children, especially our children of color east of the river. And when I think about equitable, I always think about creating a balance. And being outside among the trees and enjoying your environment, I think is really, really important when we look at how COVID is transmitted and the possibility, because I am not a scientist, that children it may be safer for them to learn outdoors than it would be inside. So as you see in Oxen Run Park is one of the largest parks in DC government's inventory. It falls under the Department of Parks and Recreation. Ab Jordan is the chair, and I'm going to save some of my time for him. But we have this beautiful park along Mississippi Avenue, Valley Avenue. There are schools, recreation centers, community along both borders of the park, and would love the opportunity to look at the possibility of outdoor learning because everybody has access to the park. They could actually walk to it. There's an amphitheater that's available as well. We meet once a month, and we'd love for those of you who are on this webinar to join us. And we have partnerships like with this group. We're partnering with the Audubon Society to talk about bird watching in Oxen Run Park. But again, I just think that this creates opportunity for our children to connect more to their environment. Scott, could you plug Ab in?
Yeah, he should be able to turn on video now. Post. Do you want to go ahead and try?
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of things. I want to focus on one of the points that Brenda made, and that was we want to explore the opportunities for learning. And so there are questions I have, but the Oxen Run is a perfect place. The question I have is one of equity. Let me just help you understand, you know, I'm 79 years old. I've been involved in education. I grew up in a family of educators. I was involved in the Parent Family Resource Centers with DC Public Schools, the Ward 8 Education Council. So education has been one of my top concerns. The question is always one of equity. And so that's one of the things we hopefully will want to explore when we have an opportunity for general questions, because there seems to be a situation in the city where some people benefit from programs and others don't. But as it stands right now, again, we want to explore the opportunities. Oxen Run Park is a place that needs to be used. And by the way, Brenda did mention the fact that we're going to have a DC Greens next year will have a farm in Oxen Run. That would be a perfect place for kids to try to relate to how crops are grown and the plant lives and stuff like that. So there's some opportunities in Oxen Run, but again, you know, we welcome this opportunity to explore it. Thank you.
And you guys are welcome to contact me at brendarichardsson724@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to send you an invitation to our meetings. But we're really excited about this and love the opportunity to be able to connect our children to education in a different way, and also to connect them to the beautiful parks that we have in the District of Columbia. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much, and for everything that Friends of Oxen Run is doing, and so many of the other nonprofits around town who really want to help our students get outdoors and have these experiences this year. And so I'm going to turn it over now to State Board of Education Representative Emily Gassoy to talk a little bit about what partnerships might look like. Saw a couple hands raised, and so in just a second, we're going to get to hands and open up the conversation and get really into the logistics of how this would work.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I know we need time to really discuss. And I just want to emphasize a lot of what you've already heard, you know, about the benefits of outdoor learning, that they're healthy, both, you know, literally, all students benefit from this, especially our youngest students. But I think, as others have pointed out, this would be beneficial for kids of all ages. And that really it does reduce the spread of the virus. And so this is a really healthy and hopefully a safer way forward. What we realize is that this is going to require all hands on deck approach. There are existing partnerships, for instance, between Friends of Oxen Run and DPR and DC Greens, which is a nonprofit that helps to train teachers and staff to do high quality outdoor education. And instead of reducing sort of those kinds of partnerships, which is what's happening right now, we should be expanding them, right? They should be really utilizing those kinds of partnerships to create high quality, sustainable, and safe outdoor learning opportunities for all students. You know, what we know is that there are families who are doing this on their own, and that, of course, is not going to be any of those things necessarily safe and certainly not equitable. And so that's why we really need system level support to support these partnerships and to make them sustainable through funding, hopefully. And something that I do want to emphasize that I don't think has been mentioned so far is that what we're proposing is really an opt-in initiative. So what that means is that it wouldn't be mandated for anyone, not families, students, or staff or teachers. And I think this is really, it goes to the point, and please excuse me if I mispronounce your name, Dr. Abdul Rahman mentioned that, you know, everybody has different health risks and needs to weigh those risks themselves. So this is an opt-in initiative that, as Scott mentioned, at this point, you know, we are proposing as sort of filling in some of the gaps that we see with the regularly scheduled school time. But as I've noticed some of the questions have asked about, you know, what about when we do return to school? And this is something we are also in conversation with education leaders about, is could this be something that continues once we return to school? And could schools and principals be empowered to create these kinds of partnerships as well, to ensure that they have, again, safe, sustainable, outdoor and equitable outdoor learning. So just want to re-emphasize again what's been said over and over, which is, you know, ultimately what we need is for to ensure that we have equitable opportunities for all families and all students. We know that this is not the answer, but that it's a really important piece of the puzzle as we try to figure out, you know, a good way forward. And I will just say, I'll end by saying, I think that support and interest from all of you, whether you're educators or families, is really important in this advocacy to encourage our system leaders to realize this is something that they need to support. So, you know, that is one of the things that we're hoping to emphasize with all of you today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And so just to get very specific about what we're talking about, what we'd really like is for the Deputy Mayor of Education and other city officials to be coordinating with Department of Parks and Recreation to create outdoor learning hubs throughout the city. Families and educators can choose to participate in. So this is all volunteer. If there are teachers who are really excited about it and they want to participate in these hubs, they get paid additional, especially if they're full-time educators already. But for anyone who chooses and has the educator credentials, who has experience in this and is excited about it, to opt in to being facilitators of these outdoor learning hubs in cooperation with Parks and Rec and other nonprofits. Volunteer for parents, right? Families who feel comfortable with it, students and families and educators who feel comfortable. An equitable distribution of hubs, and this is one of the reasons for hubs, as has been done in other places, that we want to make sure that even though we know not all schools have equitable access to outdoor space within their own campus, that if we set up hubs throughout the city, all of those who are interested and comfortable with the option would have the access to it and the opportunity. Safety and health protocols first. So we absolutely have to reduce spread, right? And we've advocated for a lot of things citywide about what we need to do to prioritize this. And we've done a lot on, a question came up about safety, which we've been considering very intensely since the beginning, how to make these outdoor spaces safe, especially in neighborhoods where violence is a concern, even being out at a Parks and Recreation facility. So we've closed streets for restaurants throughout the city. And one thing that outdoor learning has done in other places is closing the surrounding streets around schools where they're doing outdoor learning to make sure we have a safe environment for our children to learn outdoors, or closing the streets potentially around these hubs to make sure that we have a safe space for children to engage in these activities. And in the same way that we have adults engaged in making communities safe, to make sure we have adults engaged in keeping the spaces for outdoor learning safe from the community. And then outreach by city leaders and the chancellor to all the local education agencies, to all of our schools, about staff and family interest, their comfort level with doing this, because we're proposing hubs equitably distributed across the city, but we also know that there are a lot of schools who would like to do this as a model. And so when the metrics do come down, when we feel comfortable going back to some kind of in-person learning, that this should be an option for schools to move those classes outdoors where possible, and especially for our youngest learners, to have small groups, to follow the health protocols, but have a safer space to be back in schools than being inside of our school buildings. So we know there's a lot of questions. We want to get to those now. What about the weather? How do we access bathrooms? What about transportation? Where does the staffing come from? We've heard all of those concerns, and And we're happy to talk to those and others, but we want to get now to your questions. So I'm going to stop the share here so we can see everyone. And
can you put my email in the chat box? Mine is only on private.
sure. So Brenda, go ahead. Can you say that again?
Oh yes, can you please put my email in the chat box because it's only on private?
Can you share your email? B.
Brenda Richardson 724 @gmail.com.
All right, so everybody should be able to see that now. And I know we have a couple hands up and some Q&As. So I want to go to, let me see here. I can open it up for you to talk and ask your question. So give me 1 second. And I want to go to Marjorie. Would you like to share your question?
Sure. I guess I have a couple of questions, but my first question was, who's going to fund some of these high-tech tents? Because as y'all know, the weather does not always cooperate, so we'd have to have some sort of shelter for them. My second question is, I teach 8th grade physical science, so I'm just wondering how that would look in an outdoor situation.
Sure, anyone want to speak to that?
I'll just say, Marjorie, that this is precisely why we need system level support. I think the funding piece is key. And there was just an article in the Atlantic a couple of days ago about exactly this, that, you know, we know that families are forming hubs, but as I said before, we don't know how sustainable they are, right? Those things, they cost money, it takes energy, and especially if we're trying to do it equitably and at a larger scale, I agree, we definitely need funding. So we are hoping to get support from the DME, from the Chancellor, but we can also perhaps look for funding. I think there's a lot of interest in outdoor learning. So,
and I did want to go because this might be on the same topic. I'm trying to see if Andy is still there. But let me go to Crystal first, who's had her hand up for a second, and we'll come back to that discussion of funding. There have been a lot of partners to reach out and say that they really want to help with this. And so I think both that we really want to encourage this as a public investment, a long-term investment. So we want the city to invest, but there are also private partners interested in helping students access these spaces and nonprofits. Crystal Powell.
I'm having some problems with my computer today, so my speaker keeps going in and out. But I did pose a question about this wonderful initiative. I think my question was, you know, parents, the only way that this will, you know, really be beneficial to all of our parents are fully engaged. And I wanted to know how are we doing the outreach to our families and our communities, and for families that might be interested in this, how are we going to get
Appreciate that. And that's definitely been something we've been talking about a lot, and Brenda might want to address, but we're planning a series of parent focus groups, especially east of the river. Brenda, do you want to?
Yeah, Crystal, thank you for joining us. As we look at reigniting our children's spirits, we also realize that it's important to connect with parents. So we are looking at hosting some focus groups in September with parents, just so we can, number one, share the concept, number two, engage them, and number three, we can't do this without them. So it's important for us to have partners like you that's willing to be a part of this initiative. And we'll just move forward from there, because we're just starting. This is like at the very ground level, and we're just starting. Thank you, Scott.
And just confirm really quickly, this is open to public schools and charter schools, right?
Absolutely. The goal is to make it available to all families who want to access it.
And just, you know, as a classroom teacher, I know, and I teach in a charter school, I just know curriculums differ. DCPS does one thing. Charter schools do a whole completely different thing. So how would you, I guess, intertwine those curriculums to make sure that the students are getting exactly what they need according to their school's pacing guide, you know, and their curriculum?
Yeah, and I want to repeat that the goal is not to replace everything that schools are doing virtually, but to provide something that's really missing, right, from those approaches, which is the need for the social interaction, to see each other in person, the mental health benefits, the experiential learning that can happen outdoors. And so if schools are able to move this to institutionalize it, right, it's something that schools do outdoors, there will certainly be, you know, following of a curriculum. And Colin spoke a little bit to how that can work, especially with early childhood outdoors. But we're now with the hubs, we're really talking about kind of enrichment, right, on top of curriculum.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to talk to that before I go to the next question?
When you say talk to that, are you talking about the curriculum or other issues?
Yeah, the curriculum question. So we had a question I want to address. I think the person who asked it might not be here now, but we had several, I think, questions in the chat also about comfort level and violence in the communities. And so I definitely wanted to make sure we address that and give any other panelists a chance to talk about that. As I said, one of the considerations has been how do we close streets and make that accessible? But Colin also talked about a long-term thing, which I think is really important, which is kind of reclaiming these public spaces, both the equitable access to them and the safety of them for the community. Anybody else want to talk about the safety element?
I do. I think there needs to be something more, a stratified program, so to speak, for this, addressing the question of safety. At Oxen Run, we do have a problem with violence. And even though we have the schools that are contiguous with Oxen Run itself, they are experiencing problems with the violence themselves. So that's one aspect. And the other, when we start talking about closing off streets and what have you, we do those for certain kind of occasions, but you know, there also have been individuals and groups who raised questions about people's constitutional rights to have access to these facilities. So whatever we're talking about planning on doing, we need to take into or examine it from all perspectives, take into consideration not only the positive benefits we think we will accomplish through this, but the blowback we're going to get from people who say that we don't agree with that particular thing. So that's where I am on the question of violence. I have another question later on, but I'm just concerned about it because we know, those of us who are there at Oxen Run, we know some of the problems that exist. We want our children to be safe before anything else. I mean, I know we've emphasized the safety in terms of the coronavirus. You know, at some point we may not have that as a factor, but the safety as a physical situation will always be a factor, and we have to take that into consideration. And we need to address that. It's not just say we're going to leave it for somebody else to address. We need to have discussions around it and come up with some concrete ideas about how we deal with it.
And that's why we think it's, you know, really important that that this begins with talking to people in the communities, right, that are most impacted, and we make sure we're having very personal, individual conversations with parents and others about how they feel, right, with this option and what considerations need to be taken into effect. Ultimately, we're advocating for a solution where we see a gap in equity, but we really need the city institutionally, right, to think about these questions more deeply as well, right, because it will not be just, right, a group of advocates or teachers themselves to solve larger issues of safety, even though we have to address it very seriously, right? But that we need the city to invest, we need partners and nonprofits and community members and parents to come together to address those problems. And I wanted to quickly address a question from Steve, a couple questions from Steve about a comfort level versus letting the science guide us in returning. And I would say both and to that, right? So one is that for everything, I think in this age where every family is dealing with unique circumstances, we want to give parents choice about what activities they feel comfortable allowing their children, right, to engage in. At the same time, none of it should happen without the right health protocols, right, and safety being in place. And so the starting point is to make sure we are at a right place, knowing the science right around being outdoors, the science around how we have to socially distance and wear masks and what precautions to take and when it is safe, given levels of community spread, to do any of these options. So absolutely starting with the scientific indicators, right, that we need. But we don't want to force anyone, whether it is a teacher, right, or a parent, into a situation they might feel uncomfortable with, even if we're in a better place with the virus.
I would also like to share that DPR is a very, Department of Parks and Recreation is a very important piece of this puzzle, because at the end of the day, whatever their protocol is for the park is what we will have to adhere to. So I want us to be mindful of that.
And I will just add to that, that I think this is precisely, again, why we need this to be something that is system-wide, because we need that guidance. We need the safety guidance to be consistent across sites. And so if this is going to be, I mean, we know it's happening already, right? But it's happening in an ad hoc way. And so that is something that needs to be addressed. And yeah, we need guidance to keep everyone safe. But we do know, and this, I mean, this goes to the question about whether this would be for older students too. We do know that for younger students, coupling that reduced risk factor that younger students don't spread it as much, apparently, with the outdoor learning or outdoor spaces being safer, that was also part of the consideration, as well as thinking about who benefits least from online learning. So those three factors, I think, are really important in, you know, the thinking around focusing first, at least, on early childhood.
I just also want to add, I think there was a question about comfort, and you guys are addressing. You know, when I was talking about comfort, I also mean, like, you know, individual assessment of risk. So, you know, if somebody has a child with asthma and they know their child best, they may not feel comfortable, even if it's, you know, lower risk to be outdoors. And so there is definitely a level of comfort anytime you take risk. So it's not ignoring the science. I mean, I think we do know a lot, but there's also a lot that we don't know. And so especially when it comes to aerosolized inhalation of the virus, I think that's something where, you know, we think happens, but we don't know to what extent it happens. And so I think if people are following the, you know, wearing the mask, you know, well, first of all, you know, as long as there is, you know, a very low community infection rate and people are following the usual, you know, public health guidance, wearing masks, washing hands, and staying home when they're sick, I definitely think that outdoor learning is definitely a lower risk situation, especially when you compare the loss of learning with children, especially young children, and the impact that has to them long term. And I also want to say that I didn't really talk too much about the studies that are out there because, you know, again, there's very few studies. There was a study from South Korea recently where there was very low transmission from children to teachers. There was more transmission between teachers, adults, as opposed to like children to teachers. So again, I think we do know some information in terms of risk or outbreaks in children. There are schools in Europe that have you know, did go back to school, and we have some information about outbreaks mostly in older children. I think there's an outbreak in France with a high school. But again, I think that when there is a low community spread, when we're following the guidelines of wearing a mask, washing hands, staying home if we're sick, I think the risk of outdoor learning is low.
I apologize that I had a problem with the poll launching too early there, and so I'm putting it back up here. If you voted, if you can go ahead and vote again. Sorry, on the poll. So we just want to get a sense of everyone who's with us today. We're going to do a couple of polls here. Your ward, and then your kind of affiliation, your role, and how your comfort level with outdoor learning now. So I'm going to keep that up so folks can vote in the poll and we can reflect on that. I also wanted to answer a couple other things that have come up. One is the weather, right, concerns. And so this is something we obviously thought a lot about. And there are several answers to that. Obviously, there are schools that do outdoor learning year round and feel very strongly that it's not a matter of the weather, but just the right gear and the right clothing. And so obviously, there's, especially our young children, I think are very adaptable, right, in that way. But there's a lot of infrastructure, right, to make this work well. So first of all, these can all be, I'm not sure why the poll is kind of continuously relaunching there, but if that's not working, we'll allow folks to kind of share in the chat. So so there are tents, and someone mentioned kind of a couple things: access to the bathrooms. What if there's a wind event, right, or something where you really can't be outside? And so in those cases, when we're talking about schools, we've really advocated for these to be pretty close to the infrastructure of a building, so that if students need to go inside one at a time with an adult, for example, to a bathroom, that would be possible. But I think it's, in some cases safer to have actually bathrooms set up in kind of porta potties or those nicer kind of trailers, right, with bathrooms set up outdoor near the outdoor hubs. So there's safer ways to kind of think about the bathroom structure, and then being close to the indoors where you have large indoor spaces with better ventilation, right? So whether it's a Parks and Rec center, or it's a school where you're setting up near, where you have access to the gym or the cafeteria or a larger indoor space where if you needed to be inside, you could use that space. But again, we're probably talking about, at least in the initial model, we're proposing limited time, right? So they would not be out for 7 or 8 hours straight, like an entire school day. They would be out just for a portion of hours during the day, and certainly schools that have used a full outdoor learning model, many of them use a kind of hybrid where they are indoors for part of the day in a larger, safer spaces with better ventilation. So all those things are certainly considerations.
Can I just raise a question with you? I'm trying to respond to the poll, but it's not accepting my input. So how do you input it? Should you just click on the word that you want or the question? I'm doing that and it's not responding.
Yeah, for some reason it keeps going up to 8 responses and then stopping. So I'm not sure why that is. And it might be people who've already voted, but I'm gonna end this poll for now because actually one thing, and we got a little bit of a sense of representation, which is great, but when our webinar ends, and I wanna make space for any questions that remain, when our webinar ends, it's gonna automatically redirect everyone to a survey. And that'll give us everyone an opportunity to kind of weigh in on this, and for anyone to follow up in the ways that they're interested in following up on this issue and giving feedback and being involved in the ways that you'd like to. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have one question. We talked about the health safety and what happens with outdoors, when kids go outdoors and less opportunity to transmit the virus. Are we saying that the kids will not have to wear the mask when they're outdoors, or what?
So, I don't know if
No.
Dr.
Yeah, I just want to say, again, the CDC is recommending children older than 2-year-old to wear the mask, and that is if they keep it on and don't keep touching it, then it's probably the safest thing. But it's, as we all know, trying to get kids to keep on a mask is difficult. And we all have, I have a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old who, he keeps it on temporarily and then he'll take it off and he touches it. And I don't know how effective that is. And like I said, the one study that I know with children in South Korea, where they did go back to school, the risk of children passing it on to adults is low. But I also think that I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, in that school, I think the kids were wearing masks. But there are other European countries where they have gone back to school without wearing masks and they have not seen as much transmission, but those are all, I think that's places in Germany where they have a low transmission. So.
No, what I'm concerned about is we've got to convince parents to participate in the program, am I correct? So one of the questions I'm sure they're going to ask, I would ask if my children were in school, and I have grandchildren who are in school. So the question is, or great-grandchildren went to school too. Yeah, but the question for me is, when they're in this outdoor learning process or activity, are they going to be required to wear a mask? It can be answered yes or no.
So
I would say yes, is what I would.
Yeah, because right now we're all very clear that Mayor Bowser has said that we all must wear a mask when we're outside. So it goes back to what I shared earlier about the protocol, because I don't think that we are at liberty to decide yes or no. We have to adhere to whatever the protocol is. So right now, everybody's required to wear a mask when you're outside.
I think that's really goes back to the importance of reducing the community spread, right, to help advance any of these solutions, right, and that we all have to be invested, right, in that for that to work, because right now that is the mandate, right, that we all wear masks anytime that we are outside the home, and it's really important given the state of community spread in our city. At the same time, we acknowledge the reality, right, that it is very difficult to get young kids like I have to wear masks for an extended period of time. My 2-year-old and 4-year-old are pretty good about wearing masks for a short period of time, right, but all not for hours, right, in a row. And so one thing I would say is Dr. Abdul Rahman mentioned Germany. Also, Denmark has been doing outdoor education for a long time. The spread is lower, right, in those places. So they've gone back to school primarily outdoors, actually, and not using masks, right, in the outdoor setting, have seen very little spread, but that's really contingent upon getting the spread down, right, in the community first. And so really, we all need to kind of have that communal focus on how do we get the spread down. And then outdoor learning is a safer option than being indoors, because the virus still exists, even when the transmission is low. And so even at that point where we get community spread down to a more comfortable level, it's not going to feel completely safe without a vaccine, right, for us to go back into buildings. And so when we get to that point, this is really an option that is safer, right, in that setting. Do we have other questions from the audience? I'm going to look through Q&As and also our chat. And I'm going to launch one more poll. We'll try this one more time on a different question here to get a final reflection before we leave. Oh, and there was a question earlier about what about older learners, because we've talked a lot about our younger learners, and I think that's important. I'll say, as a former high school teacher, I have been itching this whole time to, like, I wish that I could be leading like outdoor excursions with kids where we're doing like a history walking tour around the city. And so I think something that could be really potentially exciting for our older learners, especially those that could participate in something, and I'm sorry for the poll snafus, but for our older learners, that they could actually participate in options where, you know, they can actually be on their own, right, with an educator or a facilitator. And teachers voluntarily could sign up for experiences that they want to lead. It would be great if we coordinate this as a city, right? So there's a central place, and I think that's important for contact tracing, that teachers could say, I want to lead this experience. It's a 2-hour history walking tour. It's a walk through Rock Creek Park with students. People register, so we have a contact tracing system. It's volunteer, both for the parents, students, and families, and also for the teachers, right, who want to participate in that. DCPS, for example, has a system of admin premium pay where teachers can get additional pay for doing, you know, further enrichments for students. And so there's a lot of logistical ways that we can make options available even for our older learners. But we're focusing on younger learners, both because of the great social emotional need at that age, but also the way in which virtual learning really doesn't work, right, at that age. So we're really trying to kind of solve that gap. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate all the engagement from everyone, all your interest. It's really important as we grow this to have everybody's involvement and questions and concerns. So we're really doing it from the community, right? Not to the community, but with the community. And so we really want your continued involvement in this. And I'm gonna ask, Crystal, I think, has a quick question. So I'm going to unmute Crystal for 1 second to ask your final question. And then please hang on for a second until the end, because as you leave, you're going to have a survey on the way out. Crystal, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question, and I was just always thinking about making that sure that services and programs are available to all children. What will be in place for children in early childhood who who have an IFSP or IEP, and they might need accommodations. I want my child to go to the park, but I might need accommodations, you know, according to the instructional blueprint for their learning. How will that be handled? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm happy to address it. But Colin, do you want to speak first?
I think the easiest thing that we can do right now, I think number one, that has to be a decision made by the school themselves. And then based on your child's needs, then I would say that the school will have to make those accommodations as necessary, depending on what your child's needs are. So I can imagine that if it were a school that was willing, or grades in school that were willing to do an outside program, they will have to take that into account to ensure that those children are able to have that access as well. So I think ultimately it depends on the administration of your school, and then the teacher's comfort level in doing this, and also knowing the needs of the students within certain classes to make sure that that those needs are being met.
So,
Yeah.
so possibly you're saying that if my school doesn't comply with it, then my child might possibly not be able to attend.
So that was for, I think Colin was talking about schools doing it, right? So the school is the required provider, right? Servicer, right, of the IEP. But for the hub, I think it's really important when we think about staffing to make sure the staffing is addressed in the same way that a school would have to address staffing, so that if you needed additional staff as students signed up to service IEPs, that you would still be able to, that special educators are as involved in this as classroom educators. And so making sure that we have outreach to everyone in terms of who is able to support at these hubs, that we have people who are qualified to service individualized education plans taking part of it for the hub perspective.
And I more so think of like children with challenging behaviors, you know, making sure that, you know, you have staff equipped and trained that are, you know, equipped to handle children outdoors with challenging behaviors.
Yeah, I think that Outteach and DC Green, they do that kind of training. And that's, again, you know, why we need partnerships, is to make sure that, you know, these hubs, whether it's in hubs or in schools, that there is consistent quality, right? And that this goes again to the access question too, that it's accessible and that there's, you know, that all students would be able to access it, and that staff and teachers are well trained. So
thank you. Yeah, and we had another question here from Ebony Rose about equitable access to outdoor spaces. So this is something we were talking about a little earlier in terms of the reason for doing hubs as opposed to having this be through every school, right? Which is that we have equitable access to these outdoor spaces throughout the city, but also why we're talking about partnerships. And we've been working with Friends of Oxen Run, while we're talking about the use of our larger parks in the city, like Anacostia Park, like Rock Creek Park, and others, and coordinating through the city in coordination with Parks and Recreation Department. Now we have done audits, particularly in Wards 7 and 8. Our teacher leaders have done some audits of equitable access to outdoor spaces should schools use the model. We do have a lot of schools, right? Especially because of the renovations. And in particular, looking at the schools in Wards 7 and 8 that do actually have enclosed, right, sheltered outdoor space within their campuses that can be used. But it wouldn't be sufficient to bring all of our students back. And that's another reason why we're talking in particular about how do we bring early grades back first as a priority. And so I will mention that something we haven't talked about is that there are a bunch of DC schools who are going to be doing outdoor learning in some capacity. First of all, there are several private schools that are doing it. But then in addition, there are several public charter schools who are considering doing outdoor learning in a larger capacity starting in the next month or so. So we will have evidence from these schools, but we also do have evidence from schools who have done this throughout the country with no reported cases for months of outdoor learning to learn from others who have done this. And I just got a message that there's another question here. Sorry, let me take a second to read through. Sorry, Colin, did you want to ask that question again? I think I missed it.
Sorry. So there was a question in the Q&A just as far as addressing children switching medical needs that have medication plans at school.
Yes, and so, yeah, absolutely. And this goes, I think, with the questions of a lot of the things we talked about with servicing IEPs. We haven't talked about our English language learner supports, right? And this is why we need institutional investment from the city, right, to do it, because things like servicing medicines, like fulfilling IEPs, all of these things have to be coordinated. We're talking about a more limited time with the hubs, right? And so the instructions will be, it's a more limited window in terms of the instructions for the caretakers and facilitators, rather than schools doing this. But when schools do it full time, absolutely, they need to be complying with the same kind of requirements they would for indoor learning. And there are schools to learn from about this. So when you, one thing that's come up in the past, for example, is what about children who have allergies or asthma, right? And how we'd approach being outdoors. And so we've learned a lot from places. There's a call, actually a national call every Tuesday with cities and districts throughout the country who have been implementing outdoor learning. And there are a lot of other urban areas. So when we talk about what about violence, what about equitable access to outdoor space, there are schools in Philadelphia, in Harlem, in New York, and in Baltimore that are doing outdoor learning now or are starting it, that we have a lot we can learn from in those cases. So there's a lot of that detail to take care of, but it's why we need to kind of really have good parent engagement to make sure all those questions are asked.
I just want to ensure, can you hear me? Oh, yes. I just want to.
Now we can't hear you.
Okay. Okay, so my computer's doing something funny, so please excuse me. I just want to, just really interject that as we move forward into, the planning and preparation of this wonderful initiative, that no child is left behind, that if any child wants to participate, that they can, and that we are consciously thinking about the unexpected things. You know what I'm saying? I want every child, wherever you are in the city, if you want to have access and you want to come, to be able to come.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's critical. And I think
if I have an IEP, I can come. If I have a learning disability, I can come. If I'm handicapped, I can come. It's accessible for me.
Right.
So I just, as you plan, you just want to think about those type of things too.
And again, I think as a teacher, that's, I think, why we need to have more families involved in this. And I'm only saying that only because I know several families in other parts of the district who are forming learning pods independently at their homes or within their communities already. And I feel that should be a greater discussion as to, like the concern that I have as a teacher is the education gap. And as far as we don't want to exacerbate the issue of, students of color may not necessarily having the access that children in more affluent areas might be able to have. And so we want to present this as a way for equity, as far as we want to make sure that all students, regardless of where they are, have similar, if not exactly the same, access to these opportunities, so that it doesn't exacerbate the education gap even more post-pandemic. So really it's the idea of reaching out to families, who may not be aware, so that you can advocate for us on our behalf, in addition to other organizations, about the undying need of this issue, and think about alternatives as far as making sure that every student has that access. We don't want to just limit it to families with means to be able to do more than children who can.
And I want to respect everyone's time and wrap up here and ask you to please fill out the survey as we close out, because we'd love your continued involvement as we've talked about. And want to end on that note that Colin just mentioned, which is that there are so many inequities that have been a really bright light has been shined on during this crisis. And that's really where we want our focus to be, that we know there are students who are going to be left behind under our current model, right? That if we do exactly what we're doing now, where some families get to form pods and others don't, where some children are getting in-person learning or teachers are being put at risk in going into buildings, there's so many inequities and concerns during this crisis, right, that we have to address. But what's happening currently is a extreme exacerbation of the current inequities, right, in education. And so we have to be doing something to address that. We think that while this is not the entire solution to that, we hope this can be a part of that puzzle. And we absolutely need the engagement from everyone in the community to make the solution right for DC. So thank you to everybody who joined us. Thank you to all the panelists for your participation. Please stay in touch with us as we continue to talk about this. And if it's something you're excited about, please advocate to your city leaders so that we can continue to get the investment we need to make sure we not only do this, but can do it right. Thank you so much, everybody.